So, good morning and welcome to the 28th Annual Vanier College Symposium on the Holocaust and Genocide. I'm Marlene Grossman. I'm a psychology teacher here at the college, and I also coordinate the symposium. For more than 2 decades, Vanier College, in conjunction with the Holocaust Education and Genocide Prevention Foundation, has been the only college in Quebec to sponsor a week-long event dedicated to educating students about the Holocaust. Each year, we plan a comprehensive calendar of activities. Um, a calendar of activities that involves guest speakers, lectures, film testimony, survivor testimony, and student participation. This year was unique to the 28th symposium as we were originally scheduled for last March, but we had to postpone due to the pandemic. We felt it fitting to hold the symposium during the week of November 9th to commemorate Kristallnacht, Night of the Broken Glass. On the night of November 9th, 1938, violent anti-Jewish demonstrations broke out across Germany and Austria. Over the next 48 hours, violent mobs, spurred by anti-Semitic calls for Nazi officials, destroyed hundreds of synagogues, burning or desecrating Jewish religious artifacts along the way. Police officers and firefighters did nothing to prevent the destruction, and approximately 7,500 Jewish-owned businesses, homes, and schools were destroyed, and 91 Jews were murdered. This is unofficially known as the beginning of the Holocaust, as this marked a shift from anti-Semitic rhetoric and legislation to the violent, aggressive, anti-Jewish measures. This morning, we will be joined by Moses Gashirabake. Moses holds 2 law degrees from McGill University and an honors degree in political science from Concordia University. As a result of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi of Rwanda, Moses grew up outside his country of birth as a stateless refugee. He works in the legal profession and is currently sits on the board member of the Foundation Genocide Education, the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, and is chair of the Rwandan Canadian Healing Center.
My name is Moses Gashirabake. I'm originally from Rwanda. I was born in Rwanda, and unfortunately, in 1994, at a very early age, hell breaks loose in my country of origin. And, it forced many Rwandans to flee the country, and unfortunately, close to 1 million Rwandans were killed. So, in Rwanda, I'll just maybe begin with a little bit of context. About 85% of Rwandans are Hutus, so they're the ethnic Hutus, and Tutsis make up about 14%, and then the rest of 1% are the Twas, which I think in many media reports, the Twas are normally not reported. But if you go back to Rwanda's colonial history, the ethnic composition of Rwanda, where Rwandans were categorized as Hutus, Tutsis, and Twas, these were categories that were actually created because before colonialism, before Rwanda was colonized by Belgium, there was no ethnic categorizations in Rwanda. So essentially, when the Belgians came to Rwanda, one of the strategies that they used was to divide and rule. So essentially, creating these artificial categorizations of Rwandans who have particular physical features. They would say Tutsis are taller, they tend to be slender, they tend to have a longer nose, and then Hutus tend to be shorter, a broader nose, and such artificial categorizations, because essentially Rwanda was one nation. So Rwandans speak one language, which is Kinyarwanda. We have the same culture, and essentially these were wiped out, and there was an introduction of an identity card system, which essentially created 2 systems where one ethnic group was given more power against the other. So that created a little bit of tension. So from the late 1800s until 1959, when there was what was called a social revolution in Rwanda. So the Tutsis, who were the monarchy, who had been preferred and given a little bit of power to rule over the Hutus, or those who are perceived to be Hutus. Essentially, the Hutus rebelled and they took over power in what was called, the Rwandan social revolution, and then that led into independence, where now the Hutus, quote unquote, took power, and essentially 1959 was when I would say Rwanda experienced its first genocide. So you had a lot of Tutsis whose houses were burnt. They, lots of them were killed. Others ended up, fleeing to places like Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, and some actually ended up in Western countries. So essentially, the Tutsis that were pushed out of Rwanda in 1959, you had close to 300,000 people that were pushed out of the country. As refugees, they started advocating for themselves. They said, why have we been pushed out of our own country? So between 1959 and 1954, these people that had been forced out of the country were trying to come back home peacefully. So essentially, between 1959 and 1994, there was a lot of other types of persecutions that were perpetuated against Tutsi, because essentially whatever that was happening inside Rwanda, and it's similar to what happened in the Holocaust, was being blamed, was being blamed on the Tutsis. So even though you had a lot of Tutsis fleeing Rwanda in 1959, there were a few of them that remained in Rwanda, and these ones, faced discrimination in terms of educational opportunities, discrimination in terms of jobs, access to business and other economic opportunities. And of course, their families who were in countries such as Burundi, Congo, Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, across Africa, and some others actually ended up in the West. They organized and they wanted to, essentially liberate Rwanda, because Rwanda is a country that belongs to all Rwandans. And in 1990, when the Tutsis that were outside of the country had tried all peaceful means, they went to the UN to try and convince the UN to, get the government of the day. And at the time, we had President Juvenal Habyarimana, who was from the ethnic Tutsi. Essentially, he refused and he said, Rwanda is a country that's already full. We cannot accommodate more Rwandans to come into the country. So in 1990, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, which was created by Tutsi exiles who formed a rebel group to liberate Rwanda, essentially waged a guerrilla war against the government, so the government of Juvenal Habyarimana. So the Hutu extremists blamed the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or the RPF, and immediately started a well-organized campaign of slaughter. So essentially, between 1990 and 1994, the war, began, and around late 1993, the Rwandan Patriotic Front had gained a lot of ground that the government had been forced to start negotiating. But when the negotiations had reached, the point where an agreement was being signed to allow all the Tutsis that had fled Rwanda in 1959 and in between, Hutu extremists, unfortunately, I would say, there are many media reports that say that these are the people who shot down the president's plane in order for them, to start the genocide. So on April 6th, 1994, they essentially began a very well organized campaign of slaughter. A few months before that, there were, consignments of machetes that had been shipped into Rwanda, and essentially the meticulous organization included, lists of government opponents who were handed out to militias and were killed. And this also unfortunately included, regular families and people who did not even have any political influence. So neighbors killed neighbors, and some husbands even killed their own Tutsi wives. And basically, if you refused to kill your own wife, the Hutus would essentially kill you. And at the time, identity cards had people's ethnic group on them. So essentially, as I said, this is an issue that was created during colonialism when Belgians colonized Rwanda. So militias essentially set up roadblocks where Tutsis were slaughtered with machetes, and most of the Rwandans, were helpless. And thousands of Tutsi women were taken away and kept as sex slaves, unfortunately. In fact, 3 years ago, the subcommittee on international human rights, the Canadian subcommittee on international human rights, was examining how Rwandan women, unfortunately, were raped, and in the process, some of them actually ended up, being impregnated, and some children were unfortunately born out of rape, and now they have to essentially, it's been 26 years on since the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, and they live with their mothers, and their mothers, have lived with, the shame of telling them that, the person who is their father is actually responsible for killing essentially the rest of their family. So this is a very complicated system. And why was the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi so vicious? So the Rwandan community has always been, a very tightly controlled society, organized like a pyramid from each district up to, the top levels of government. So the then governing party, so the MRND that was led by President Habyarimana, had a youth wing called the Interahamwe, and I think most of you have heard about the Interahamwe, which essentially was turned into a militia to carry out the slaughter. So weapons and lists were handed out to local groups who knew exactly where to find their targets. So essentially, people wonder, how can 800,000 to 1 million people be killed in a period of 3 months? So essentially, this is a huge number of people, and the technology, the machinery of killing that was being used was extremely very low technology. So the reason why it happened is because the Hutu extremists set up a radio station which was called RTLM, so Radio Télévision de Mille Collines, and a newspaper which essentially circulated hate propaganda, urging people to weed out the cockroaches. So essentially, the Tutsis were branded as cockroaches in order to dehumanize them. So meaning, kill the Tutsis because these are cockroaches. These are pests and people that are participating or hindering the economic development of Rwanda. So the names of prominent people to be killed were even read out loud on radio. So the RTLM radio was actually broadcasting the names of people to be killed and their locations. And recently, one of the genocide suspects, Leon Mugesera, was actually one of the people that was speaking at the radio, and he ended up in Canada. So today in Canada, unfortunately, we do have some people who participated in the genocide that are still hiding in our society, and it's upon all of us and the Canadian government and all activists to keep, speaking out, because the propaganda that was spread on the radio played a huge role in inciting the masses. So even priests and nuns have been convicted of killing people, including some who sought shelter in churches. So it was a very well coordinated effort that indeed religious leaders also participated in the carnage of killing Tutsis. So by the end of the 100-day killing spree, around 800 to 1 million Tutsis and moderate Hutus had been killed. So, did anyone try to stop the genocide? That's the other question that keeps coming up. So the UN and Belgium had forces in Rwanda, but the UN mission was not given the mandate to stop the genocide. And among the UN soldiers, the peacekeepers that were in Rwanda, because there was a civil war going on between 1990 to around 1993, and then unfortunately the beginning of 1994 and the genocide happened, and that UN mission was actually led by a Canadian, a very honorable man, General Lomio Dallaire, who did everything to talk to the UN and tell them, Rwandans are currently going through a genocide. And this was essentially a year after the US troops were killed in Somalia. So the US had essentially said, we're not going to intervene or be involved in another African conflict. We do not want to be humiliated. So the Belgians and most UN peacekeepers, including Canadians and other African soldiers, pulled out after 10 Belgian soldiers also became victim to the killing spree. So the situation was so chaotic that international peacekeepers also are not safe. So the French, who are allies to the Hutu government, and unfortunately, this is where neocolonialism comes in again. So the French government sent a special force to evacuate their citizens, and they unfortunately set up a safe zone that essentially became a way for the people that were committing the genocide to continue, because it sort of like acted as a place where that was supposed to stop the slaughter in that area, but it ended up actually allowing the work or the evil of killing continue for a longer time, because essentially the French government was indirectly supporting the genocidal government. So, who stopped the genocide? So Paul Kagame, who is Rwanda's current president, essentially was the leader of the Rwandan Patriotic Front. And the Rwandan Patriotic Front had essentially captured a huge section of northern Rwanda. So they essentially took it upon themselves to stop the genocide. So the RPF had essentially, figured out that, the safe zone that had been created by France had a role in a way to, allow the genocidal government to continue its work. So the well-organized Rwandan Patriotic Front, backed by the Ugandan army, another African army, gradually seized more territory. And on July 4th, 1994, they essentially marched into Kigali, so the capital of Rwanda, and some 2 million Hutus, both civilians and some of those involved in the genocide, fled across the border into the Democratic Republic of Congo. At the time, it was called Zaire. And essentially, they feared revenge attacks because, the Rwandan Patriotic Front organized rebel group that had, very well-trained soldiers, and it was essentially composed of a lot of Rwandans that had been evicted from Rwanda, so mostly Tutsi and some Hutus as well, in 1959. And essentially they came back in to liberate Rwanda. And on July 4th, 1994, this is essentially when the genocide happened. So I've tried to sort of like summarize everything into, the context, what happened, why it happened so fast, and then how did the genocide stop. I would say, 26 years on, the work of stopping the genocide was essentially carried out by Rwandans, and the rebuilding of the country still continues. Unfortunately, 26 years on, even though Rwanda has made, significant strides in rebuilding, reconciliation, because, you had more than 1 million perpetrators. These are people that 1 million victims and maybe double the amount of perpetrators. So how do you try these people in courts? How do you ensure that the survivors feel that they can live with perpetrators? So Rwanda created an innovative justice system, so the Gacaca courts, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, that essentially allowed Rwandans to face each other. And this was based off of a traditional Rwandan mechanism of resolving disputes, where the perpetrator and the victim come together and they have a very in-depth conversation together with the community. Because when you commit a high crime in the Rwandan society, you're not only committing it against the person who was the victim or the survivor, you're committing it against all Rwandans. So the whole community comes together, and essentially Gacaca means, grass, and they sit down and they discuss, they try to understand why did this happen, and what's the way forward? Do we forgive? And it's definitely a very difficult process, but through the Gacaca system, that went on from around 1994 to around 2004. I mean, within 10 years, Rwanda was able to solve cases that would probably had taken probably decades to complete. And essentially what people found out is that, obviously you had, the masterminds of the genocide, people that planned it, people that reflected and indeed, distribute the machetes, or people that spoke on the radio. These are people that were tried in international tribunals, and their cases, some of them are still going on. But for the regular people, the people that were, people who unfortunately killed their neighbors, it was found out that the incitement created a very disorganized atmosphere, that some people are just doing things because a neighbor is doing it, or because it's the trend. And this speaks to the danger of rhetoric and leadership, and allowing leaders that understand the influence that a charismatic leader can have. The mayors, the governors at the time, including the president and the ministers and high-ranking military officials. These are people that went into their neighborhoods and incited the masses. And some people actually, yes, they committed the act, but the criminal mind, or the men's rare was not, you cannot establish that, this is something that was premeditated. So it allowed Rwandans, to understand the motivations behind many people coming against their neighbors, and also understanding, for example, because there were mass graves across Rwanda, people understanding, where was my mother buried? Where was my brother buried? Where, it allowed the survivors and the victims to heal in a way by understanding, why did my neighbor have this much hate? What was the origin? Was it something that they were premeditating? Was it something that they were planning over a long period of time? Yes, the masterminds were planning and doing all the work, but the people on the ground, there was another motivator, which speaks to why the genocide happens. And 26 years on, because of the innovative approaches that Rwanda has taken, you have a society that is relatively, I would say, healed. Obviously, healing from the genocide is not something that completely happens, so it's going to take more years. But I think the reflections and the thoughts that Rwandans, both the victim and the perpetrator, have been able to come together, it has even allowed people to forgive neighbors who killed their husbands, or even neighbors who cut who attempted to kill their neighbors, but their neighbors ended up surviving, and they still have the scars across their faces or their shoulders, and people have forgiven. My family has forgiven a neighbor who killed my cousins and my aunt, and it was a very difficult process. But I think part of healing is also understanding that the victim or the survivor actually has more to give than the perpetrator, and this has allowed Rwandans to come a long way. So today, Rwanda is ranked as the number 2 across Africa in terms of the ease of doing business in the country. So the borders are open again; anybody can come and set up shop in Rwanda. Environmental sustainability is, I think, the top in Africa. Over 60% of parliament is composed of women. Cabinet, I think almost 56% of Rwanda's cabinet today is women. And there's many other indicators that are showing Rwanda has been able to essentially look to the future with optimism, and I think with the dynamism of so many Rwandans, young people, that the future is bright. So that's the end of my presentation. I've tried to look at the past, the present, and then looking into the future. So I look forward to the discussion going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Moses. I'm going to get the ball rolling with a couple of questions. The first question I have is, has Rwanda put any protection in place to ensure that this doesn't happen again?
Yes, that's a very good question. So, the unfortunate thing about genocide is, we say never again at the international level, and also nationally. You have government saying, never again. We want to make sure that the genocide doesn't happen again. The Rwandan government has put in place strategies or mechanisms to ensure that this doesn't happen again. One of them is the abolishing of ethnic, including ethnic identification in national identity cards. So essentially, Rwandans are all Rwandans. So we're not having these categorizations, Hutus, Tutsis, Twas, being included in national identity cards. And Rwanda, the Rwandan government and Rwandans have come up with a national strategy that, came from the grassroots all the way up of promoting the Rwandan identity. So that program is called Ndi Umunyarwanda, and what Ndi Umunyarwanda means is I am Rwanda. So we speak the same language, we share the same culture, we share the same origins. There were archaeological studies that were conducted in Rwanda that showed that Rwandans existed together for thousands and thousands of years before colonialism began. Because when the colonialists came in, unfortunately, they created the ethnic identifications, and they essentially say that Tutsis came from Ethiopia and that the rest of Rwandans, came from Central Africa and other neighboring countries. So essentially saying that, you don't have a common origin. So that has been debunked, and archaeological studies show that all Rwandans come from the same place. And the proof is language. We speak Kinyarwanda, and there is no variation in Kinyarwanda. So number one, abolishing ethnic identification. Number two, creating Ndi Umunyarwanda as a program. And then the other thing is the Rwandan spirit of Agaciro. So Agaciro means self-worth. So essentially, what happened in Rwanda in 1994 was a campaign to dehumanize or to brand a section of Rwandans as unworthy. So the Rwandan government has created, this spirit of making sure that all Rwandans are worth, and women, children, youth, elders, everybody has value. So that's another thing. The other last value that I would say is accountability. So a government that is accountable to its citizens. So how is public money being spent? Is it being spent to purchase machetes? Machetes as it happened in 1994. Actually, the Rwandan government in 1993, 1992 procured machetes. How do you buy containers and containers of machetes? What was the purpose? So it showed, the genocide was being planned by the government. So we have systems of accountability. So in Parliament, there is a public accounts committee that looks at, government spending. How much money are we bringing in? How much of it are we spending? And it comes back to the national economy of Rwanda. So before 1994, close to 80% of Rwanda's GDP was foreign aid. And if a national government receives money from another government, they most likely will have a lot to say in how you run your affairs. So if they want to come in and take a little bit of your COPA or your coltan, or they'll give you, say, $200 million, but then they'll come in and take mineral resources worth, I don't know, $1 billion. So that has been completely changed. So over 80%, or I think it's 89% now, of Rwanda's GDP is money that comes from Rwanda's industries. So that has changed how Rwandans operate. These are our resources from agriculture, from mining, from services. This is the money that comes from our industries, and we need to be accountable for how the money is spent and how we elect our leaders. So we have in every local community a public accounts committee that looks at the spending. How much resources came in, the revenue, and how much are we spending? So that's another, so accountability of the public to ensure that, the government promotes unity, reconciliation, and togetherness as Rwandans. Obviously, unfortunately, we do have elements, for example, in the Congo. So these are people who fled in 1994, and these are composed of some people who essentially participated, perpetrators, people who participated in the killings, and they ended up in the Congo. And some of them left with the old Rwandan army. So they created a rebel group that over the last 26 years, they've attacked Rwanda, and they want to essentially finish the job, so finish the genocide that they started, because they believe that the work that they started has not finished. So that's the biggest threat to, I guess, making sure that the genocide doesn't happen again. But I'm happy to report that the Rwandan Defense Forces, so this is the National Rwandan Army, has successfully been able to defend the country, and Rwanda is the #1 safest country in Africa in terms of making sure that the borders are safe. And over the last couple of years, the threats from FDLR, so the movement in the Congo that is composed of ex-Rwandan genocidal government forces, the previous government before, right before the genocide happened. So these forces, most of their leadership has been dismantled, and we hope that, this is not going to be a perennial threat to ensure that, Rwanda stays safe. And unfortunately, again, one of the last stages of genocide is denial. So we have individuals and academics and journalists, both Rwandan and otherwise, who live in Western capitals, London, New York, including even Montreal and Toronto and other prominent Western capitals, who deny that the genocide was not perpetrated against the Tutsi. And they also promote a double genocide ideology, that this is not a genocide, it was a civil war, that both the Hutus and the Tutsis were targeted, which unfortunately is not true. This is the genocide that was planned. It's well documented that it was planned for the Tutsis. Yes, Hutus died, but that genocide was not planned against them. So, the national government has, those 4 strategies, but unfortunately there exists a threat of a military or a paramilitary group in the Congo that is unfortunately supported by, the people who deny the genocide across the globe. But there is also a campaign to just make sure that, that does not create a situation whereby, the genocide deniers and the paramilitary group that's hiding in the Congo forest comes back again and starts all over again to perpetuate the genocide. I think right now, with the capacity building that the government has put in place, security measures will be able to make sure that Rwanda continues to enjoy peace, stability, and economic growth. Thanks.
Another question, Moses. With over 1 million Hutus tried in the Gagaka courts, what has been the typical outcome or sentence for those who have been tried?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, some people have been sentenced to life. Rwanda abolished the death sentence. But one of the difficult outcomes is actually that, after people have spent 25 years in prison, they are eligible for parole. So some of the people, actually, others are even eligible for parole after 10 years. When you go in and you show that you've reformed, um, uh, you've repented, essentially, you admitted to killing and committing the crime of genocide. Some people, unfortunately, are coming back into the Rwandan society. So imagine 15, 20 years on, you're walking in the same neighborhood with somebody who wiped out your whole family. So this is very difficult for survivors, and unfortunately, some survivors are actually fleeing Rwanda. And some survivors, unfortunately, have been threatened. But again, as I said, the Rwandan society and community has made sure that the internal security, obviously, between 1994 and around 2000, those cases where people that were released from prison after, being eligible for parole and actually being granted parole came back into the society, or people that were hiding and were not found, or no evidence was sufficient enough for them to, be sent to jail, are currently living with, the survivors, and it's tough. But as the years go on, most of them are being apprehended. So that's a good thing. Canada, and when my former MP Oren Kotler was the Minister of Justice in Canada, he introduced a bill that essentially is able to indict perpetrators of the genocide in Canada. And once that has been determined, they are extradited back to Rwanda to serve their sentences. So that has allowed victims in Canada to also feel safe. So for me, the worry is, how do you protect the survivors from perpetrators who either are coming out of jail, or some of them who are still hiding and trying to, undermine the efforts to justice.
Thank you very, very much. We have no more questions from my end. If anybody has another question, they can pose it now. If not, I would like to say thank you so much, Moses, for spending time. For some of our students, this will be the first time they've ever heard of the Rwanda genocide. So it's important that we keep talking about it. As you know, in the high schools, this is not discussed. And so it's important that we keep discussing. So thank you so much. And I hope you have a great day, and we will see you soon, I hope. Thanks.
Thank you very much as well for organizing this. I think, education is one of the ways to combat genocide, and to make sure that, we remember and keep the memory and talk about, unfortunately, some of the most heinous acts that took place in the globe. And I think you're doing a fantastic job. So thank you as well for this. And I look forward to continuing the discussions, and I appreciate the fact that you're exposing these topics to students. Thanks.